For 28 years, my world was a small, four-bedroom house on a quiet street, and my universe was a man named Arthur. He was my father. My life was a meticulously crafted tapestry of his needs, his comforts, his schedule. I was the one who woke before the sun to make his coffee just the way he liked it, with a single spoonful of honey, stirred 3 times clockwise. I was the one who organized his pills into the little plastic containers, a rainbow of capsules for his heart, his blood pressure, his arthritis. I learned to cook his mother's recipes, not because I loved them, but because the scent of them in the house seemed to soothe the perpetual sadness in his eyes. After my mother passed, when I was just a teenager, my purpose solidified. I didn't go off to college like my friends. I didn't travel or have whirlwind romances. My world shrank to the size of his grief, and my job was to make that world bearable for him. I became the keeper of his memories, the buffer between him and a world that had moved on. My love for him was a form of architecture. I had built my entire life around him, a fortress of devotion to protect him from further pain. My days were a rhythm of chores and caregiving. The morning was for his needs, the afternoon was for the house, and the evenings were for him. Reading the newspaper aloud because his eyesight was failing, or watching old black and white movies that he adored. My own dreams, the faint whispers of a life I might have wanted, were packed away in a dusty box in the attic of my mind. I told myself it was noble. I told myself it was love. And I believed it. The sacrifice was the point, the proof of my devotion. I was a good daughter. It was the only identity I had ever known. The day it all shattered started with the mundane. A stepladder, a burnt-out light bulb in the hallway, a simple misstep. I remember the sickening crack as my arm hit the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden, sharp silence of the house. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up from my wrist to my shoulder. Arthur rushed in, his face a mask of panic. For a moment, seeing his fear, I felt a strange sense of comfort. He needed me, and now I needed him. We were in this together. The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and muffled reassurances from him. He held my good hand, his knuckles white. At the emergency room, the chaos was overwhelming. The smell of antiseptic, the frantic beeping of machines, the cries of people in pain. A nurse put me in a wheelchair and took my information. When she asked for my insurance card, I pointed to Arthur. He handled all of that. He fumbled in his wallet, his hands trembling slightly, and handed it over. I was focused on breathing through the waves of agony, trying not to pass out. A doctor finally saw me, his face kind but professional. He confirmed it was a bad break, a compound fracture of the radius and ulna. I would need surgery, pins, a cast. He began explaining the procedure, but then the administrative nurse returned, her expression tight and confused. She looked from the chart to Arthur, then to me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low. "There seems to be a problem with the insurance. It lists you, Mr. Jensen, as the policyholder, but she isn't listed as a dependent. We can't admit her for emergency surgery under this policy without a significant down payment." I looked at Arthur, expecting him to be outraged, to argue, to fix it. It was just a clerical error, surely. He had always taken care of everything, but he didn't look angry. He looked pale, cornered. The doctor, sensing the tension, stepped in. "Sir, we need your consent to proceed. We can figure out the billing later, but as her father, you can authorize the emergency care." The room fell silent. The beeping of a heart monitor somewhere nearby seemed to grow louder, a frantic metronome counting down the seconds of my old life. Arthur slowly pulled his hand back from mine. He wouldn't look at me. He stared at a spot on the sterile tile floor, his jaw tight. He started, his voice a dry whisper. He cleared his throat. "I can't." The nurse frowned. "Sir, I don't think you understand. Your daughter's arm is severely broken." He cut her off, and the words he spoke didn't just break the silence. They detonated my entire reality. "She's not my daughter." The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I stared at him, convinced I had misheard, that the pain was making me hallucinate. The doctor and nurse exchanged a confused glance. The nurse tried again, her voice gentle, as if speaking to a confused old man. "Sir, this is your daughter, Amelia Jensen. You brought her in." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met mine for a fleeting second. They were the eyes of a stranger, cold, distant, and filled with a terror I didn't understand. "I've raised her, yes," he said, his voice gaining a horrifying firmness. "But she is not my child. I am not her legal guardian. I can't sign for her." Time seemed to warp. The sharp edges of the room softened. The sounds faded into a low hum. The only thing that was real was the chasm that had just opened between us. The man who was my entire world, the center of my gravity, had just cut the cord. I was floating, untethered, in the cold, sterile space of that emergency room. The pain in my arm was nothing compared to the cataclysmic agony ripping through my chest. 28 years of sacrifice, of love, of identity, erased in a single sentence. I wasn't his daughter. Then who was I? My world wasn't just shaken. It was annihilated. That man, my father, turned and walked away, leaving me in a wheelchair, with a shattered arm and a life in ruins. He didn't look back.
Naquele momento, meu chão desapareceu. Foi a dor mais profunda que já senti. Se você já passou por uma grande decepção e entende o que é ter o coração partido, por favor, curta este vídeo para eu saber que não estou sozinha nesta jornada.
The days that followed are a gray, formless fog in my memory. The hospital, legally obligated to stabilize me, set my arm in a temporary splint, and sent me home with a prescription for painkillers and a bill that made me feel dizzy. Home. The word was a joke. I took a taxi back to the house, the only place I'd ever known, and found my bags packed neatly on the front porch. The locks had been changed. He hadn't just disowned me. He had surgically removed me from his life, as cleanly and cruelly as a tumor. There was no note, no explanation. Just my few clothes, some books, and a small box of personal items. He had left me an envelope with a few $100s inside, which felt more like an insult than a kindness. A severance package for a life of service. I ended up in a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind with a flickering neon sign that hums all night and stains the room in a sickly pink glow. For the first week, I barely moved. The physical pain in my arm was a dull, constant throb, but the emotional agony was an active, vicious thing. It was a monster that lived in my chest, clawing at my ribs, whispering his words over and over again. "She's not my daughter." The sentence became the soundtrack to my life. I would wake up gasping for air, the words echoing in the silent, stale room.
Who was I?
If I wasn't Amelia Jensen, Arthur's daughter, then I was nobody, a ghost. I had no friends to call. My life had been so insular, so focused on him, that I had let all my other connections wither and die. I was completely and utterly alone. The money he left me dwindled quickly. The motel, cheap as it was, still cost something. Food was an afterthought. I survived on crackers and tap water, my stomach in a permanent knot of anxiety. I would stare at my reflection in the grimy bathroom mirror and see a stranger, a pale, hollow-eyed woman with a clumsy cast on her arm and a look of profound bewilderment. My identity had been a garment woven for me by someone else, and now that it was ripped away, I was naked and freezing in the wind. It was during one of those long, empty afternoons, when the despair was so thick I could barely breathe, that I turned to the small box he had packed for me. It was mostly junk, old birthday cards, a few faded photographs of me as a child with a woman whose face I barely remembered, my mother. And at the bottom, beneath a threadbare baby blanket, was something else. A small, wooden box I'd never seen before. It wasn't his. The craftsmanship was different, more delicate, with intricate carvings of vines and small birds. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not jewelry or money, but a book. It was a small, leather-bound journal, the pages yellowed with age. The writing inside was a graceful, looping script I didn't recognize. It was filled with drawings of plants, flowers, and herbs, alongside handwritten notes and recipes. It seemed to be a book of herbal remedies, salves, teas, and tinctures. Tucked into the back was a folded, brittle piece of paper. It was a letter half-finished. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. It began, "My dearest little sparrow."
Sparrow.
A name I'd never heard. As I read on, my heart began to hammer against my ribs. It was from a woman to her child, a letter full of love, regret, and promises of a future together. She wrote about her gardens, about the healing power of the earth, about a wisdom passed down through generations of women in her family. The letter wasn't signed with a name, only a small, elegant drawing of a sparrow in flight. There was no mention of Arthur. There was no explanation. But I knew, with a certainty that resonated in the very marrow of my bones, that this book, this letter, was from my real mother. It was the first piece of my own story I had ever held in my hands. It wasn't an answer, not yet. But sitting there in that bleak, lonely motel room, with the hum of the neon sign as my only companion, it was a spark. A tiny, fragile glimmer of light in the suffocating darkness. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than pain. I felt curiosity. The book was a map, and I had no idea where it led, but for a woman who had no name and no home, it was a direction. It was a beginning. That little book became my lifeline. In the beginning, it was just something to do, a way to keep my mind from spiraling into the abyss. I would spend hours just looking at the drawings, my fingers tracing the elegant script. The names of the plants were like a foreign language: comfrey, calendula, yarrow, mullein. I used the last of my money not on food, but on a few cheap pots, some soil, and a handful of seed packets from the local hardware store. I turned the grimy windowsill of my motel room into a tiny, makeshift nursery. The first time a small, green shoot pushed its way through the soil, I cried. It was the first sign of life, of hope, I had seen in months. I started small, following the simplest recipes in the book. A soothing tea from chamomile and lavender for my anxiety. An infused oil of arnica for the deep, aching bruises on my arm. I had no money for doctors, so I had to learn to heal myself. I began taking long walks in the patches of wilderness behind the motel, the book in my hand, matching the drawings to the plants I found growing wild. I learned to forage, to identify the healing weeds that most people overlooked. It was a slow, painstaking process. Many of my early attempts were failures, salves that were too greasy, teas that were too bitter. But with each attempt I learned. The work was demanding, occupying my hands and my mind. It left little room for despair. I was no longer just waiting for the day to end. I was working toward something. The rhythm of grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, of stirring a pot of simmering oil, became a form of meditation. I was connecting to something ancient, to the woman who wrote this book, my mother. I was learning her language, the language of the earth. My first real victory didn't come in the form of money or success, but in the form of a little boy in the room next to mine. He was about 5 years old and suffered from terrible eczema. His mother, a young single woman working 2 jobs, had tried everything: steroid creams, expensive lotions, but nothing worked. The boy was in constant, itchy misery. I would hear him crying at night through the thin walls. One evening, I gathered my courage and knocked on her door. In my hands, I held a small jar of a calendula and chickweed salve I had perfected, following a recipe from the book for skin fire. She was skeptical, but also desperate. I showed her the simple, natural ingredients and told her to try it. I didn't ask for money. I just wanted to help. The next morning, she knocked on my door, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in months, her son had slept through the night without scratching. The angry red patches on his skin were already calmer, less inflamed. She hugged me, a stranger, with a gratitude that was so pure it took my breath away. In that moment, helping that little boy, I felt a sense of purpose that I had never known before. It wasn't the borrowed purpose of caring for Arthur. This was mine. It grew from my own hands, from my mother's legacy. That was the turning point. The boy's mother told other people in the motel, who told their friends. I started making more salves, more teas. I set up a small, folding table at the local farmer's market, my few jars lined up neatly. At first, people walked by, skeptical of my homemade remedies. But slowly, one by one, they gave me a chance. An old farmer with aching joints tried my comfort rub. A young woman with migraines tried my feverfew tincture. And they came back the next week, and the week after that, bringing their friends. I wasn't a nameless ghost anymore. I was the herb lady. People started calling me Sparrow, a nickname that stuck after I told the story of my mother's letter to a curious customer. I was building a reputation, a small business, a life. I eventually saved enough money to rent a tiny storefront, a little shop I filled with drying herbs, glass jars, and the earthy, comforting scent of my work. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I had built it from nothing, from a handful of seeds and a legacy I never knew I had.
Foi ali, com as minhas próprias mãos, que comecei a reescrever a minha história. Deixei de ser a vítima e me tornei a autora do meu destino. Se a minha jornada de superação está te inspirando, inscreva-se no canal para acompanhar os próximos capítulos e fazer parte desta comunidade de recomeços.
2 years passed. 2 years of hard work, long hours, and the quiet, steady joy of building a life that was truly my own. My little shop, which I named Sparrow's Garden, had become a sanctuary for many in the community. I wasn't just selling remedies. I was offering comfort, a listening ear, and a connection to something natural and healing. I had friends, I had a purpose, I had a name that I had chosen for myself. I hadn't seen or heard from Arthur since the day he walked out of that hospital. I had tried, in the beginning, to find answers, but he had simply vanished. I accepted that he was a closed chapter, a ghost from a life that no longer belonged to me. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, the bell above my shop door chimed, and he walked in. He looked older, smaller, diminished. The arrogant certainty he once carried was gone, replaced by a frail uncertainty. He was leaning heavily on a cane, and his breathing was shallow. He looked around the shop, at the shelves overflowing with jars and dried herbs, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and something that looked like awe. He didn't seem to recognize me at first. I was no longer the pale, defeated girl in worn-out clothes. My hair was longer, my eyes were clear, and I stood tall, cloaked in the quiet confidence of my work. "I'm looking for the owner," he said, his voice raspy. "I was told they sell things here for pain." My heart, which I had thought was long since healed, gave a painful lurch. But I kept my voice steady, calm. "I'm the owner," I said.
I am Sparrow.
"How can I help you?" His eyes finally focused on my face, and a flicker of recognition, followed by shame, crossed his features. "Amelia," he whispered, using the name I had left behind. "It's Sparrow now," I corrected him gently. We stood there for a long moment, the silence thick with unspoken words, with years of pain and betrayal. He was the one who broke it. He told me he was sick. A degenerative bone disease was causing him constant, excruciating pain. The doctors had him on a cocktail of medications that barely touched the agony and left him in a fog. Someone in his new town, a nurse, had told him about a woman in a nearby city who made miracle herbal remedies. He had come seeking a miracle, not knowing he was seeking it from the daughter he had abandoned. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. He tried to appeal to the past, his voice weak and pleading. "I know I don't deserve it, Amelia," he said, "but I'm your father. I'm in so much pain." The old me, the girl who had built her life around his needs, would have crumbled. She would have set aside her own hurt to soothe his. But she was gone. I let him speak, and when he was finished, I took a deep breath. "You are my father in every way that mattered, Arthur," I said, my voice devoid of anger, filled only with a quiet, sad truth. "Until it became inconvenient. You left me in a hospital with a broken arm and a shattered life. You took my name, my home, and my entire history. The woman you're asking for help is not the girl you threw away." His face fell. He had expected anger, perhaps, or even a tearful reunion. He had not expected this calm, immovable strength. "I'm not going to turn you away," I continued, "because what I do here is about healing, and that's bigger than what happened between us. I have a salve that can help with your pain. It's made from comfrey and St. John's wort. It's $20 a jar." I treated him like any other customer. I explained how to use the salve, the ingredients, the expected results. I was professional, detached, and polite. I did not offer him a discount. I did not offer him pity. I did not offer him the role of father back into my life. He paid in cash, his hand trembling as he gave me the money. As he turned to leave, he stopped at the door. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "All those years, why did you lie?" I looked at him, the man who was both my creator and my destroyer. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something close to pity. He was just a weak, frightened man, terrified of a secret I still didn't fully understand. "I don't have that answer, Arthur," I said. "That's your story to carry. Mine is just beginning." He left, and I didn't watch him go. When the bell chimed, signaling his departure, I felt a final, profound release. It wasn't about revenge or forgiveness. It was about peace. It was about closing a door not with a slam, but with a quiet, final click. My legacy was not my pain. It was this shop, this life, the people I helped every day. It was the knowledge passed down in a leather-bound book from a mother I never knew, a woman who had given me a gift far greater than a name or a home. She had given me the seeds of my own resilience. Today, my life is full. It's a simple life, but it's rich and it's mine. I have a community that supports me, work that fulfills me, and a peace that I have earned. I never found out the whole story of my birth, and I've come to realize that it doesn't matter. My roots are not in a family tree, but in the earth itself. I am a sparrow who learned to fly after her wings were broken. I am a garden that grew in the most unlikely of places. I learned that the deepest wounds can sometimes create the most fertile ground for a new beginning.